Most people never look twice at the man sitting near the back of the plane. Worn gray hoodie, faded jeans, old military-style backpack, we find it with a small rainbow pin near the zipper. Not the kind of passenger who makes headlines. Not someone the first-class travelers care to acknowledge. Just another quiet, forgettable presence in economy class. But on this particular flight from Seattle to Washington, D.C., the man in seat 22A wasn't just anyone. He was the ghost they once called Midnight Viper, a name whispered across encrypted radios, a code name that once made entire squadrons adjust their course midair. And no one on that plane had any idea who they were flying with. His name was Eli Monroe, 32 years old, a former Air Force pilot, retired for internal reasons that were never explained publicly. His discharge papers were buried in classified files. His service record had more redacted lines than readable ones. Since then, he'd kept to himself, never drew attention, never spoke of his past. Just Eli, one, quiet, watchful, disappearing into the crowd wherever he went. That morning, Eli boarded the commercial flight like anyone else. He passed by the polished suits in business class, the designer handbags, the overpriced lattes balanced on tray tables. As he moved through the aisle, he felt the stares, the subtle, slighting glances from passengers who judged without needing to speak. Every step toward the back of the plane was a quiet verdict. Too rough, too worn, out of place. He kept his eyes low, his hands steady on the frayed straps of his backpack. The small rainbow pin, an old gift from a friend who once told him, "You shouldn't have to hide," glinted faintly under the cabin lights. No one noticed it, or if they did, they pretended not to. A flight attendant, Olivia Hart, blocked his way with a perfunctory smile. She glanced at his boarding pass, 22A. "That's near the back. Please make your way down," she said, tone clipped, detached. There was a subtle emphasis on back, as though the seat itself defined the man standing before her. Eli nodded silently and moved past her. 2 rows ahead, a man in a navy suit leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Probably one of those last-minute discount guys. Surprised they let him on this route." There was a quiet chuckle, the kind that stings harder because it wasn't even meant to be cruel. Just honest. Honest. In the way privilege always thinks it's telling the truth. Eli said nothing. He didn't react. He never did. He just found his seat, row 22 window side, and sat. One hand placed his backpack beneath the seat. The other rested over his chest, just above the small rainbow pin. A brief pause, then nothing. He stared out the window, the noise of the cabin fading behind the hum of memory. This wasn't his first flight. He'd flown missions where every second meant life or death. He'd once charted escape vectors through hostile skies while enemy radar closed in. Now he sat in coach, treated like baggage. It didn't matter, not to him, not anymore. But what no one knew, what the suits and attendants and passengers scrolling their phones in first class would never guess, was that just a few hours from now, this quiet man would be the reason everyone on board would fall silent in awe. And for the first time in years, the name Midnight Viper would echo again across a runway. If this story moved you already, stay with us. Because Eli's silence hides more than pain, it hides a legacy. Subscribe to Heart Story for the full journey. And remember, sometimes, the quietest souls carry the loudest truths. Because judgment is easy when you think you know someone, but the sky remembers what people forget. The aisle felt narrower the longer Eli Monroe stood in it. As he made his way to the back of the plane, each row he passed came with its own quiet chorus of judgment, some whispered, some only visible in the eyes that followed him like a shadow. His hoodie, a shade of gray once vibrant, now dulled by time and use, seemed to absorb every condescending glance, every upturned nose. By the time he reached row 22, the air around him had thickened not with turbulence, but with assumption. A pair of women seated near the wing clutched their designer purses a little closer as he passed. One of them, in a pearl-colored blazer and heels too high for air travel, didn't bother lowering her voice. "I don't know why they overbook flights like this," she murmured. Soon anyone off the street will be sitting next to us. Eli said nothing. His silence was no longer retreat, it was armor. A few steps later, a man in a sleek charcoal suit adjusted his gold cufflinks as if preparing for a meeting. Not a flight. He leaned toward his companion, nodded toward Eli's direction, and said with quiet amusement, "Probably just lucked into a discount fare. They're practically giving those back row seats away now." They shared a low laugh. Eli heard it. Of course, he always did. But his face gave no indication. His hands gripped the worn straps of his backpack a little tighter, then released. He lowered himself into 22A with careful precision, avoiding eye contact. Head slightly bowed, not out of submission, but because he had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting out loud. He slid his backpack under the seat and adjusted the small rainbow pin on the front pocket. A gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for habit, but to Eli, it was a reminder. Not of pride in the loud sense, but of quiet resilience. That even when the world refused to see him, he saw himself, and that was enough. As he settled in, the cabin around him continued its hum of low chatter and shallow entertainment. Laughter from business class floated back like perfume sweet, curated, distant. Eli stared at the seat back in front of him, unmoving, while others reclined in privilege. He didn't need recline. He'd slept in cockpits, in deserts, under the heat of silence and responsibility. Comfort had never been a guarantee. A voice pierced the air, sharp, flat, polished. "Mr. Monroe." It was Olivia Hart, the flight's lead attendant. Eli looked up slowly. Olivia stood with her tablet in hand, tapping the screen with a perfectly manicured nail. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," Eli answered. She held his boarding pass between two fingers like a receipt. "You're in 22A. That's further back." Her tone wasn't cruel, but something colder, clinical. A passive-aggressive melody honed by years of practicing false customer service. Eli nodded once. "I'm already here." She paused, eyes scanning him head to toe, then offered a thin smile and turned away. No apology, no welcome, just confirmation of her assumption, another man who didn't belong in a space built for others. Eli leaned back. The seat creaked faintly beneath him. Outside the window, clouds began to gather. The jet bridge detached. The plane rolled away from the gate, its nose aiming eastward. The rest of the passengers continued with their flight, some sipping wine, others watching pre-downloaded dramas. A boy tapped away on a tablet while a woman applied lip gloss using her phone's camera. No one noticed Eli. They never did. And yet, above them, in the empty sky they were about to enter, there was a memory of him, a shadow burned into radar systems, a call sign that once made generals sit up straighter. But down here, on this plane, he was just the man in the last row, quiet, unremarkable, an afterthought. The strange thing about judgment is that it rarely arrives with violence. It comes dressed in politeness, in the sterile phrases of a flight attendant, in the soft chuckles of entitlement. It hides in plain sight, and yet cuts just as deep. And for people like Eli, who've had to survive both war and assumption, every silent moment is a battlefield. Because sometimes the hardest wars are fought where no one is watching. The descent was announced with a slight dip in altitude and the muted chime that made passengers stir from their drowsy states. A few groaned, some folded laptops shut, others barely noticed. It was a scheduled stop for refueling routine. Unremarkable, Andrews Air Force Base. The name meant little to the civilians on board. Just another waypoint before Washington, D.C. To Eli Monroe, it meant something else entirely. As the plane aligned for approach, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm and crisp. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a short stop at Andrews for refueling. Please remain in your seats unless otherwise instructed. Select passengers may be invited to disembark briefly for a tour opportunity with the Air Force flight crew on base." That announcement sparked curiosity. In business class, a few regulars perked up, clearly used to the perks that came with influence. Whispers rippled through the forward cabin. Names would be on a list, They said, passes already arranged. It was just another advantage for those accustomed to getting more. Eli remained still. His name would not be on any list. He hadn't set foot on this base in years, not since the day he handed over his badge, his clearance, and the weight of things never spoken. Even then, his departure had been sealed in silence. Internal reasons. The file had read, no parade, no speech. Just a closed door and a lifetime's worth of ghosts left behind it. As the aircraft taxied near the refueling zone, a few passengers began gathering their belongings, anticipating an exclusive detour onto the tarmac. Olivia Hart, clipboard in hand, walked briskly down the aisle calling out names. She didn't glance at row 22. She didn't need to. Her voice rang clear and deliberate. Only those whose names are on the list will be permitted off the aircraft. Eli kept his gaze forward. Then the cabin door opened. The noise changed airbase sounds, replacing the hush of controlled flight, the low rumble of engines, the sharp clack of boots on tarmac, the sharp hiss of fuel lines being pressurized. And then, a presence. Boots echoed on the boarding ramp. Not rushed, not uncertain. Commanding. A figure stepped into the cabin. Not a flight attendant, not a civilian, a man in full uniform, bars and insignia gleaming. The cabin fell quiet. The rustling of bags and the tapping of phones abruptly stilled. The man's eyes swept the aisle like a scanner, searching. His posture never faltered. His eyes locked on row 22. He spoke, not with volume, but with force. Bidu Hawk 12. There was a beat, a second that stretched like a wire pulled taut. Eli stood. The officer's voice grew louder, reverberating down the cabin. Midnight Viper, sir. The cabin was breathless. Eyebrows lifted, jaws parted. A businessman near the front turned his head so quickly he dropped his sunglasses. The officer straightened. It is my honor to welcome you back, sir. And then, as if rehearsed but deeply sincere, the entire F-22 flight crew visible from the cabin windows stood in formation on the runway and raised their hands in salute. One by one, no hesitation. Eli didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, walked past the stunned rows of passengers, and stepped into the light of the open door. His hoodie remained zipped. The rainbow pin on his bag glinted like a soft answer to years of invisibility. Behind him, no one spoke. No one laughed. The man in the suit who mocked him earlier shifted in his seat, his expression fractured between disbelief and shame. Olivia Hart's clipboard lowered, her lips parted but silent. In just a few seconds, every assumption they had made was undone. Eli had never needed to speak for himself. The sky was already doing it, and in that moment, the quiet truth of dignity echoed louder than any broadcasted heroism, because respect isn't something you can measure by seat numbers, suits, or status. It's not earned by how loudly you speak, but by how you carry the silence. The tarmac shimmered beneath the sun, heat waves rising like echoes of past missions. Eli Monroe stepped forward, boots crunching lightly against the concrete, the hush of the cabin left behind him. His posture remained quiet, unassuming, but every step he took seemed to pull the silence further into reverence. The man who once slipped unnoticed into seat 22A now walked with the weight of recognition pressing gently at his back. Waiting for him near the line of F-22s stood a pilot in his mid-20s, face flushed, posture rigid but eyes brimming with something between awe and disbelief. He held something close to his chest, a helmet, blackened by time and wear. The flight insignia slightly faded, but still clear, a silver hawk cutting through midnight blue. The pilot's voice broke as he spoke. "Sir, this belonged to you." He extended the helmet with both hands, and Eli took it without ceremony. Just a quiet nod of acknowledgement. He ran his fingers along the stitching inside. Midnight Viper embroidered in thread, but carried in the memory of those who had once followed his lead across skies no civilian had ever seen. It wasn't just a helmet. It was a witness to countless hours of silence in hostile airspace. It had felt the tremble of evasive maneuvers, the stillness of waiting in radar shadows, and the jolt of adrenaline when coordinates changed with no warning. For those who knew, it was more than gear, it was part of a legacy. The young pilot's voice cracked again, but steadier this time. You saved us. That day over the Gulf, when the comms failed, none of us knew what to do. Then we heard your voice on the fallback channel. You guided us home. We never even saw your face. Eli held his gaze, then looked away toward the line of saluting pilots. It was never about being seen inside the aircraft. Passengers leaned toward the windows, straining for a glimpse of what was unfolding beyond the glass. The same man who'd been dismissed as a discounted traveler now stood beneath the wings of fighter jets, surrounded by uniformed honor. The whispers began again, but not of ridicule this time. Questions laced with unease. Is that really him? Why didn't anyone say something? I thought he was just some drifter. Above, two F-22s roared to life. Their engines shook the cabin as they rolled into escort formation, one on each side of the civilian aircraft. Eli remained where he stood as the civilian plane prepared for departure, watching the jet bridge retract, the door close. He lifted the helmet once more, briefly placing it against his chest before handing it back to the young pilot. No one flies alone, Eli said, barely audible over the hum of turbines. Then, without another word, he turned and boarded again. As the aircraft lifted off from Andrews, the two F-22s followed like shadows, silent, watchful. From the cabin windows, passengers looked on, their earlier indifference now replaced with awe. Cameras rose, videos were taken, yet no one spoke too loudly. No jokes, no snide remarks. Then came the moment no one expected. Over the cabin speakers, through the aircraft's internal channel, a voice crackled in, not the pilot, not the tower, but a military channel briefly patched in. It was clear, strong, and reverent. Midnight Viper, we never got to say thank you. A pause. Eli, seated again in 22A, pressed a button on his armrest. The crew had already enabled the communication line. It had been pre-cleared. His voice came through calm, measured. Even after all these years, keep your formation tight. Eagle 1. And just like that, the radio went silent again. Not a single person in the cabin breathed. What they had witnessed was not showmanship. It was not staged. It was recognition earned in the most unforgiving skies. And somewhere between cruising altitude and humility, a lesson unfolded, one that couldn't be taught by ranks or uniforms or the seat number printed on a boarding pass. True worth is never loud. It does not ask for a stage. It walks past mockery with quiet grace. And when the time is right, it answers only to the sky. When the plane touched down at Ronald Reagan Airport, there was no applause, no celebratory cheer, no flight attendant chirping about weather conditions or welcome home slogans. Just a heavy, contemplative stillness that had settled over the cabin like fog, the kind that follows a reckoning. Eli Monroe stood slowly, retrieving his old backpack from beneath the seat, the same scuffed bag that had traveled with him through deserts, hangars, deployment bunks, and now this. The rainbow pin caught the light once more as he slung the strap over his shoulder, its quiet presence now unmistakable, no longer a thing ignored. Passengers parted wordlessly as he made his way down the aisle, the same people who had whispered behind their hands, who had rolled their eyes, who had once seen only the faded hoodie and economy seat now stepped aside, uncertain what to say. Some looked down. Others followed him with their eyes, regret surfacing where arrogance once lived. Olivia Hart stood stiff at the door, arms clasped tightly. Her voice was faint, her usual flight briefing tone now replaced by something softer. Mr. Monroe. But he didn't stop, didn't need to. The runway lights stretched out like veins beneath the airport, and just beyond the security barrier, a man waited. James Harrington stood beneath the terminal archway, dressed in a dark blue suit, not the kind worn to boast, but the kind that says, I'm present. His stance was still, dignified, but his eyes, those eyes held something only two people could ever understand. Love Yes, but also history, pain, sacrifice, years of waiting under scrutiny. Eli's expression didn't change as he approached, but something softened when James stepped forward and reached for his hand. No hesitation, no secrecy, just two men who had earned the right to be exactly who they were. Public, legal, equal, fingers intertwined, a silent message between them. We made it through. A gasp rippled from the group of passengers exiting behind him. One woman, now recognizing James not only as Eli's husband, but as a prominent, openly gay congressman, covered her mouth with her hand. James glanced at her, then gave Eli's hand the gentlest squeeze. They walked on together into the terminal, past rows of polished shoes, past cameras now lifted with shaky hands, past people who no longer knew how to categorize what they were seeing. But the story didn't end there. By the time they reached baggage claim, the video had already gone viral. Someone on the flight had caught it all: the salute on the runway, the helmet, the F-22 escort, the call sign, and finally the hand held at arrivals. Within hours, hashtags trended. Hashtag Midnight Viper and hashtag Seat 22A, Eli Monroe, and in offices across D.C., consequences unfolded. Richard Hale, the smug defense consultant who'd mocked Eli's presence on the flight, was called into a meeting and handed a termination letter. The company he represented had contracts with the Air Force. Disrespecting a war hero on video, unacceptable. Olivia Hart was grounded. Not fired, but removed from international routes. Pending retraining, they said. Her file marked with the phrase, "conduct unbecoming in presence of high-clearance veteran." The influencers seated in rows 10 and 11 who had filmed Eli with ridicule in their eyes. Sponsorships dropped them by the afternoon. PR firms issued apologies on their behalf. Too little, too late. But Eli, he never once mentioned in their names, it never responded to the frenzy. He simply walked back into life with James dignified, private, and intact. Because it was never about revenge. It was about being seen as human. The world will often place value in the loudest voice, the biggest bank account, the fanciest seat. But real worth isn't measured in upgrades or uniforms. It shows in how someone walks when no one's clapping, how they love when no one's watching, how they choose silence. Not because they're small, but because they know who they are. And sometimes the person in 22A doesn't need to prove anything. They already wrote their legacy in the sky. Have you ever judged someone too quickly only to discover later they carried a story far greater than appearances ever revealed? Tell us in the comments. And if Eli's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful journeys like this one. Because some stories aren't just heard, they're felt and remembered.